Hello. Hello, internet world. You are watching the Jamaican Sounds show, Funtime Variety Hour or so. I am DJ Monkey Man, and I am joined tonight with James McDonald. Thank you for joining me, James.
Hey,
Just a
how are you?
little, I am doing well tonight, and is looking forward to a fun conversation. Um, and just to throw a little info so people know, James, if you do not know, he is the drummer for Eastern Standard Time, was also in the Skunks. And from what I saw, played drums on a Ready Steady Go
That's right.
song or album as well. So, and we've got some more of that. We'll get into more conversation about that kind of stuff. Um, so I guess we'll just start it right off. Like my first thought and question is like I want to know the history of James McDonald. I want to know. So, from am I correct in my research in finding out that drums is actually a family affair and that your
That
dad
is
plays?
that is correct. You've been doing some digging. Yes, my father was a drummer. In fact, the drum set that I play now was his, that he got when he was a young man. So it's kind of it's one of these things, is that tight balance that you have with the family heirloom, right? Do you take the family heirloom on tour with you? Especially because they're like antiques at this point.
Yeah.
They were made in 1948, so it's like, I think I need to take care of these things maybe a little bit better. But yeah, my father was a drummer. He was a jazz drummer, and he also uh, played um, Scottish pipe band music. He was a drummer in that, and also played the bagpipes. And when I was younger, he got me involved in that, taught me some, and then we actually played together in several um, Highland pipe bands in the drum line, going all over North America and doing competitions. And I imagine you probably found this out by finding out that we had recorded together on a record that
Yeah. Yeah.
the band put out.
Discogs.com.
Yeah,
It reveals all nowadays.
yeah. So yeah, my father got me started on that, and actually the whole family is musical. My mother played guitar and sang in groups through high school and college, and even after that. And my brother, who played in Eastern Standard Time for a time, is a pretty accomplished musician on his in a, outside of ska circles. He presently writes, does composition work for, does a lot of studio work, does performance as well, and does a lot of scores for various different, movies, television
Nice.
commercials, audiobooks, all kinds of stuff like that. So
Definitely
very
a
mu-
musical family then.
very musical family, yeah.
Yeah. So
So
so that then led you, obviously you learned drums, you became a drummer, percussionist, and I guess that how did ska become like from Irish, I guess, from pipe band and playing with bagpipers and stuff? How did that lead you into, how'd ska come about in your life, I guess?
I thought I had. It's one of those funny stories. Like, I thought I had discovered um, the two-tone bands when they first started appearing in the United States. Making some sort of an appearance, that I would notice, like on commercial radio, right? So Madness and the Specials were the ones that I had heard the first, and then eventually managed to do a little bit more digging and find some of the other groups. But I got into this, and before that point, I had been pretty much. Actually, that's not true. I had not really had much interest in any one particular kind of music before became interested in that. But it didn't. The way my life was at the time when I heard this stuff, it wasn't like I could get on my bike and go to a record store. There just simply wasn't one around me. So it really wasn't for a few years after that that I was able to go to record stores and find music on my own. And even then, you couldn't find that in the record store. You had to ask them for it, and then
Special
they would
orders.
special order it for you. Um, and so it took a while for me to like make this sort of transition from like I like this music a lot to I sort of define myself around this music. And in the meantime, I had uh, sort of was defining myself more in terms of a punk rock scene, and I was very much interested in ska music, but it wasn't like the primary thing that I was listening to. It was mostly first metal and then punk. Um, and then I guess it probably got to a point where I don't know, some switch just flipped where I found myself listening to ska music far more than I was listening to punk. I would go to the punk shows, but I would buy the ska records. And eventually I got more and more into it, and sort of defined my lifestyle around it. And then I one day, and this is all, I'm still living with my parents at this point, right? So we're talking about the ages from somewhere between, I don't know, 12 and 16, right? So that span in there. At any rate, so I'm really into it, and I'm playing it all the time. And at one point, I can't remember, I made some comment about having discovered this music or whatever. And my mother's like, "What are you talking about? You've loved this music for ages." And I was like flabbergasted. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And apparently, and I have no memory whatsoever of this. Well, I have like a really vague memory of going to the place, but not of what my mother told me I had done, which was there was a corner grocery store that my parents used to shop at. It was owned by a Jamaican family, and they would play ska and reggae music there. And I apparently, as a toddler, would beg my mother to take me shopping so that I could stand next to the stereo or the radio they had and listen to the music. I was so apparently I've been into this for a really long time, but just didn't know it. And I think that's kind of cool because, in a way, we're shaped by all of the music that surrounds us all the time, and
Yeah.
sometimes it takes hold, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think even when it doesn't take hold, it leaves these impressions on us, so that we're really maybe it leaves us more receptive to it later on, and maybe it's just like it just sort of adds to that you know it's like you go from like having a box of 8 crayons to having a box of 64, or
Yeah.
that kind of thing, or your toolbox, just your mental or stylistic toolbox just is increased. And I like that. I like having um, those echoes from music that I used to listen to show up in my life again.
That's a really like interesting and really cool like story to have. That is of the music that you've now pretty much, like mostly dedicated your musical life to. So
Right.
that's
It's
really
like,
awesome.
yeah. And I think a lot of these things too are um figuring out what works for you in a moment. So and apparently, as much as I love ska when I was 12, 13, 14, it wasn't really until I was like 15, 16 where I was like, okay, I really like this music, and I'm going to start trying to make this um what part of who I am,
Yeah.
that I I don't know, it's a weird sort of transition you make in that period of your life too, where you go from um where you start to create your own identity, right? And that's always, you're always creating your identity. I mean, I don't want to say
Oh,
that
absolutely.
stops at any one point, but you really do move from this point at which you're just like, I'm no one particular thing. I like listen to this radio station, and I ride a skateboard, and some days I do this, and you're not really, it's not a lifestyle per
Yeah.
se, and then it becomes a lifestyle, right? Then decades later you're still playing ska music like me.
And so that started, I guess, in what that would have been really in your, would that have been late teens, early 20s that the Skunks then started? Or were you, or was there
Um,
other before that?
right. So I guess it probably would have been about 1986 or 87 or something like that. A couple of the guys who ended up forming the Skunks with me had, and I, together with a couple of other people that we knew, had a punk band that was really not very long lived. Maybe a summer or something we played together, but for some reason or another, and I don't even remember why. Um, there was an interruption where we didn't play for a while, and then when we got back together, not all of us were available anymore, and I think this would have been probably late. A bunch of us. I'm trying to put all the actual sequence together, but so and because a lot of this was really loose, it was like it wasn't even really necessarily planned that we would get together and rehearse or any of these things like that. But eventually, um, all of us had been um, really active skateboarders, and we all went to this same. Um, it was basically a water drainage ditch, a municipal water drainage ditch that the local skateboarders had sort of blocked off so water really couldn't go through it anymore, and smoothed out the ditch with concrete, and that was where all the skaters went to
So
skate.
they made it into a skate park, basically.
Yeah, basically, because the nearest skate park, real skate park at that point, was about an hour and a half away, and most of us didn't have cars. So we met each other skating at this place or at school, and shared an interest in skating. But and we were all kind of sitting around one day, and we were like, the thing about Washington D.C. is that we've got this amazing punk scene, but there's a lot of punk bands. Like everybody is in a punk band, and I think we might have performed like twice or something with that punk band before the Skunks, and it was fine and all, but we were just like, I really want to do something different, and I can't remember exactly who suggested it, but we all also liked ska music, and we're like, there are no ska bands. We should play ska music. I mean, that would really be fun, and nobody else is doing this in our area. So let's just see what happens. And so that was the idea of that was probably sometime in, I want to say it was sometime in 1987 when that happened, but it really wasn't until 1988 that the band became a band that, oh no, excuse me. Am I getting this wrong? Yeah, I'd have to look up the actual
Wikipedia
date.
said 88, if that's
Yeah, that's well, because like there were shows before the origin, like the very first show that the band played, um, and because we played a whole bunch of backyard parties and stuff like that. In the first years, we were playing backyard parties or even house parties more than we were playing shows in clubs. But yeah, so that was sort of how it all came together, was just a bunch of friends who rode skateboards, who liked punk, who liked ska, who liked hip hop, all different kinds of stuff. And we just got together and started playing, a clearly two-tone influence ska, but as a bunch of punk rock kids who were playing ska, there was no doubt about the fact that we were going to bring some of that into it as well.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
and it was fun. I mean, we kind of really didn't realize. I think for a really long time with the Skunks, we never really realized exactly, um, sort of, and I don't know that many people at the time did, who were involved in the ska scene back in the mid to early '80s. We things that turned out to be later like kind of a big thing. We're just like, oh, cool, we got a show. Oh, it just happens to be with like some amazing bands, and we were very relaxed about it at first. I think it took the band quite a while to start taking themselves seriously, and I'm not sure we actually ever did, which is fine actually, because that really was part of the I guess part of the joy of the Skunks was just that every single time we did something together was like we were kids who had far too much, you know, far too much candy and we're on a field trip, right? I mean, just every it was and that was really enjoyable in a way, you know. I mean, we didn't take ourselves too seriously, and I think that was that we were better for it in a
Yes.
way. Yeah.
And so then, like, I guess, so as I was researching, you pretty early on, you guys started then touring with the Pie Tasters and then the Toasters shortly
Right.
after
So
your
it
first
was
album, I guess.
we did our first tour with the Toasters. And if you want to call it a tour, I mean, it was basically 3 shows out of town.
A mini
Um,
tour, yeah.
but I mean, that counted because we didn't really um, there weren't a lot of active ska bands, and there wasn't this network of communication. So even when there were active ska bands, it took quite a bit of effort to be in touch and to stay in touch. I mean, we're talking about writing letters to each other and sending cassettes and hoping that maybe one day you might be able to play a show together. And so linking up with the Toasters was a really great thing for us because clearly they had been at it for quite a bit longer, really knew what they were doing, and sort of saw beyond the fact that we were uh, young and foolish and full of excitement and perhaps not so much purpose, and saw that there was something in there that was fun to have along, and so they invited us to play quite a number of these, usually 3, 4, 5 day runs. So we did one down in the Southeast. We did Midwest a couple of times, several shows out in Chicago area, um, and I guess I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to look up when. I think the Pie Tasters got started in 1990, maybe, or they were down in the Blacksburg area, which is for those tuning in, it's like 4 hours south of DC because they all went to school down there. Or even though most of them were from the DC area, they went to school down there. So at first, when they got together, I don't know that we were in super close contact. And I actually um, left the Skunks for a period of time and was living abroad. And when I came back, the Skunks had uh, sort of linked up with the Pie Taster, and we were playing shows together at that point. So I don't know that I don't think we ever did touring together though.
Yeah.
We did the occasional show together, and I believe that we might have had our tours intersect on like a single show once or twice. But we didn't actually do much touring together. And in fact, um, we didn't actually really do very much touring with DC bands as like a package ever, which is really a bit of a shame because DC very quickly had a really active ska scene. I mean, when the
Yeah.
Skunks formed in '88, there was a band called the Now that had started shortly before us. They were a couple of years older than us, and we really looked up to them quite a great deal. And then there was also another band of guys who were roughly in our same social circles and went to some of the same schools that we did, called the Townsmen. Um, and beyond that, it was sort of a bit of a trick to kind of find bands to play with because you could play with punk bands, or there were some other ska bands in Bim Scala Bim, of course, the Toasters we already mentioned, they were active. um, and pretty soon we got to know some others, you know Scram from Philadelphia, and New York Citizens, of course. And um, I think a lot of that, though, in those early years was a bit of a like I said earlier, a little bit of a struggle. Like you had to figure out how to get on the right bill to meet the bands, right? You could be calling each other on the phone or sending letters and stuff, but a lot of times, getting a show together was not always something that bands could control. Um, but luckily, very fortunately, the we established very early on. We established a very nice and close knit relationship with the talent buyer at the 930 Club in Washington D.C. Um, and uh, because of that, we're invited to play with as the opener for a lot of the ska and reggae acts that came through. So that was always really nice, and it was a good place for us to network because then those bands often helped us quite a great deal later on down the road. So
Nice. And this is all, like one of the, I guess, things that I got into, I didn't get in, I was into ska when in the 90s when, the big boom hit. And this was all before all of that even. And so it's one of those, I had Mixed Nuts, one of the, the Skunks great albums, which was released on Moon Ska, and that kind of came to me. And that was, while in that time, but to me, I did not realize, like as someone who was just, I was a kid and just found ska music. I didn't necessarily pay attention at that point in time of like when the stuff came out or who,
right.
what the bands were. And so it wasn't this big thing where like, yes, people were like, yeah, come on, we want to, I'm sure like, was it like, were the clubs, as you book tours, you said it was pretty hard to link up with bands. Were the clubs pretty open to ska at that time? Or was it still even just like we don't want to take a chance on that music?
um, I think it varied.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
nice.
it's hard to really recall because a lot of times, you were calling people up and sort of pleading your case. And building business acumen takes time.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there were plenty of rejections that I now don't really even remember, because I really only remembered the ones where it worked. And I called up and they said, "Yeah, okay, yeah, we'll do something." And one of the things that and I've felt this way through throughout my both when I was in the Skunks and throughout all the time with Eastern Standard Time, is that one of the things that I think is really important for any band is understanding how a band fits into a larger family of people who work very hard to make a show happen. So having good relationships with talent buyers, with club managers, with sound engineers, with stage hands, with bar staff, with door people, everybody is, it's like, you know, the band is just part of the entire evening. And so one of the things, once we did get that door open, um, I think perhaps I would like to hope that some of that willingness to establish long-term relationships and intent to have it be a long-term relationship was welcomed, because we did have clubs that we would play over and over and over again, and that was nice. It was really
Nice.
nice to have that sort of relationship. Uh, but a lot of times they were sort of ambivalent about what to do with ska acts. Either it was booked as a package, or they would put you, and this actually still happens quite a great deal. They would put you with just a random act in the hope that there would be some sort of a crossover audience or what have you. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it was less successful. I remember seeing Bim Scala Bim and De La Soul together. But I mean, DC also does a lot of those types of things where they will have like a punk band and a go-go band play together, and those types of things.
Nice.
Those, in some cities that works, in some cities it
Yeah.
doesn't. And the other thing that was really great too is that over time, uh, we, and I say we as in not just the Skunks, but as in like the entire scene, started to become more interconnected. And geographically, things didn't seem as far as they once did. Like to me, it seemed like impossible when the Skunks first started to play shows in New York or um, you know, anything that it's like a 4-hour drive or something like that, let alone places like Chicago or Florida or California. It was just not something that anybody really thought about. But because it was a scene, you still wanted to stay in touch with people and figure out what was happening in their neighborhoods. And so, even though at the time I never really foresaw that the Skunks might ever play in some of these cities, I was writing letters to people all over the world, like asking them, like, "What's your scene like? What Do you see any good shows? What's a good band that I should look out for?" And actually, I still have these many years later, I still have contacts to a lot of those people, which is really rewarding.
Nice. That is pretty awesome to hear.
Yeah, and I didn't really close the circle. I started to, but I wanted to close the circle on the fact that like pretty soon, like so Skunk Startup now starts probably 87, Skunk Start 88, Townsmen about the same time, and then probably around 1990, 91, all of a sudden there's actually even in 89, there's tons of ska bands that start showing up in DC around that time. I remember even it's probably 1989. We did a show at the 930 Club. I think we did 13 ska bands.
Wow. Okay.
So I mean and not all of them were from DC. I mean, we brought
Yeah.
in bands.
So
I think actually we brought in Bouncing Souls for that one. I can't remember who else, but I reached out to a lot of bands when putting that show together. I reached out to a lot of bands that I was like, I don't think they're going to travel to DC for this, but you never know. And yeah, so we had a couple of bands come in from out of town that I was a little bit surprised they made it in. But so yeah, it really did start to blossom like right after um, that 88, 89 period.
nice. And so
Okay.
then that led. Sorry, go ahead. What?
No, I
Oh,
just
nice.
wanted to close that circle because I started saying we had a lot of bands from DC, and then I only talked about two of them. So
Absolutely. But I'm sure that I mean the Northeast that I'm sure blossomed. You always hear there's the Northeast ska scene and then the California ska scene or like East Coast West Coast kind of thing. And that I'm sure like in it I guess it was around 92 is when you guys got signed on to Moon Ska. So did that was that helpful and then kind of growing more being signed to I mean I'm not sure how big of a label they were at that point in time. Did that help with connections? I'm sure like being able to connect with
yeah,
other bands and stuff like that.
very much so. One of the cool things we did the Chaos and Scaville record we released ourselves on our own label, and uh,
Which I love the label name PU Records.
PU Records, yes.
Perfect.
Um, and then that we then subsequently licensed that to Moon Records. So Moon took over distribution of that and managed to push that then through several additional pressings, or press runs, manufacturing runs of it. So that was quite a big help because they had a distribution network that we didn't. I mean,
Absolutely.
we could sell lots of, actually we sold quite a lot of merch at shows, but getting outside of that was not possible unless you went to play a show in a particular place. And so Bucket and Moon Records put it into their catalog, sent it all over the country, all over the world, really. And that was very helpful. And then, yeah, so for the Mixed Nuts record, which was no, actually, then we released the Pinata 7-inch, which was not on Moon Records. We did that ourselves. But then don't know if, I don't know if that ever got picked up for distribution initially. But we actually, it was sort of reasonably short run, but we ended up doing multiple press runs of that in various different colors. And then we did the Mixed Nuts record, which was from the beginning fully a Moon release.
Nice.
Early on, I think we had some ideas that doing things ourselves was, I don't know, it fit more with our punk rock ethos or something like that. But I think Buck was like, why won't just come do it with me? And we're like, yeah, all right, we'll just do that.
Yeah.
Because we would do these things and then not talk to each other. So Buck would sort of figure, he's like, wait, you released a record? Why didn't you talk to me? Like, oh yeah, we just didn't really think about it, and it's true. I mean, it wasn't like, one of these things. It was just we were sort of in our own bubble. And like I said earlier, when we were being really, um, you know, the kids on the field trip, a lot of that kids on the field trip was that we just figured we had to do our own thing all the time. And Buck sort of uh, said, look, I can help you guys. Let me help you." And he did. He really, the Mixed Lunch record was the first record that we did a national tour on. We got out to the West Coast, came through St. Louis for the first time. So that was uh, that was really a sort of a groundbreaking record for the band, and got us into a lot of places. I mean, we go into places and people would already know who we were, which was a new thing for us. Normally,
Yeah.
we needed one or two shows in a market before people remembered who we were and got interested and followed the band actively. But it was kind of a neat thing to come into a city that you have never been to before. You don't know anyone in there, and there's people at the show who already know your songs.
Yep.
We're like, this is not. This is weird for us. But it's
Which,
one of the best. But honestly, it's, as a musician, it's one of the absolute best feelings when you don't know anybody in the crowd and they know your music, because it means you've made a connection to a complete stranger, and that's so powerful. I mean, it's really, really great.
nice. Which that's also around that same time when you guys I saw the Skarmageddon, which I believe is when I discovered the Skunks, was the Skarmageddon
Oh yeah,
compilation that started
yeah,
back there, which I believe it was Big Haired Girls
yep.
appeared on that one. And that was actually that was the first time I heard the Skunks for sure. And like so many other ska bands. And I think that like back in the day, the compilations were huge.
The
And that
compilation
was,
scene, that was something else. I mean, we were just trying to get on as many comps as we possibly could, because I mean, there's such a good idea to give people an idea, a taste of lots of bands at once. And I really think that's something that's sort of disappeared,
I agree. I agree.
to the detriment of the scene in a way, because now everybody can make their own comp, and there's something really empowering about that. And I think that's great too. But having something, where somebody's like, check this out, this is a spectrum, because, and I'm guilty of this. So, when I make this accusation, please understand that I fully hold myself in this category. We build bubbles, and we live inside bubbles. And the way you grow musically is to step outside of that. And you might not like everything on a comp. You might not like most of the things on a comp, but that you might discover that one thing that really changes like how you think about music. And so for that matter, I think that's why making your own comps, like, it has its place, but having something curated can really
Absolutely.
expand your horizons.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of I think the podcast world and
Right,
the like just mixed kind of like SoundCloud stuff like that where people throw playlists out on Spotify.
right.
It is cool, but then it's also still I love that like I am definitely, as you can see behind me, I am a fan of the medium, as you behind you. We talked about that earlier, like the books,
Yeah,
CDs, records, all of it. And I think that is one of the things that I did, and just for fun, tried to do a kind of do it yourself comp to give to other people. And
right.
like that's what like I want that, but like I want you to design me a cover, give me info on the bands, like give me some
Right.
liner notes. Like that's what like don't just throw me a playlist on Spotify. Like pick some
Right.
good artists to just send me random songs from.
Hmm.
It's definitely
Yeah.
something that's missed out on lately in this day and age.
Well, I don't know. I mean, a lot of people are pushing, sort of pushing in back against the idea that old media is
Obsolete.
somehow or another not um, I don't know, not valid or what have you. I mean, I love what Chuck Wren at Jump Up Records has been doing with cassettes. I think that's really fantastic that people are taking an interest in that because there is a tactile part of experiencing a record, right? I mean, a song is great, right? I mean, songs are what the records are built to hold, right? But I mean, there's like this contextual thing about having the container that's designed for the sound, if that makes any sense. I mean, there's
Yeah.
just it's part of it. It's an experience. If people are really interested in retro experiences, which by no means are all of them good, don't get me wrong, but there is a certain amount of uh there's a certain amount of the experience of music lost in uh not experiencing it in a way that especially if you're interested in vintage music, there's something to be said for experiencing it in the way that it might have been experienced in its original format.
I
So
I fully I mean, I love records, and I'm loving, and that is definitely, there are times when, yeah, like I could easily sit at my computer or like even go on a walk and listen to an album on my phone, but there's something about taking that record off of the shelf and pulling it out and having the sleeve with me and like sitting and putting the needle on it and listening to it,
mm,
or like that. And I even have one of those all-in-one record player, cassette player, CD players. And so I have, I was found some old demo ska cassettes from somebody on eBay, and it's just sitting and
uh,
listening to those old school mediums is fun for sure.
that's great.
So going back to the James story, we'll do a little bit more in this because that led you. So you left shortly after. Well, actually, first let me go back because I saw one thing on Wikipedia that so originally you guys had released a demo tape that you went out, and is
Yep.
that so? There is apparently, from what there's at least one somewhere still in existence that somebody on Wikipedia claims to still have as one of their prized possessions. Is
Yeah.
that, do you know, are there other copies available anywhere? Like or is that like become digitized in any way, or?
Um, I don't have a a fully fledged copy. So when that was released, it was a cassette tape that had a J card and all of the stuff that went in it. I have the recordings that went on it, but and then I have a couple of tapes that don't have the J card. But over the years, one by one, those things tend to disappear. um, some of them I gave away, I'm sure, to people who were interested and what have you, and other, I've moved. There are plenty of possessions I have no idea where they are anymore.
Understandable.
They may be even be in the attic right now. I mean, but I mean, yeah, I mean, I honestly, if I have one, I don't know where it is.
Yeah.
But I do have the songs that were on it. I have the recordings.
Nice.
And I might have a couple of the cassettes. I know I have one. I might have more than one that are, you know, Skunks demos. Um,
Nice.
but
Well, I
there
will
was
I
a
will I will say that, I don't know about the rest of the internet world out there, that there are definitely people who would love to, get a peek to the original Skunks.
well, I'll
If it
see.
ever gets around to being digitized by any of the guys. So
I'd have to make sure that the guys would be okay with
I get
putting that
that too.
stuff
I get
out.
that. Yeah.
But I mean, the nice thing about it, and this is one of the things that um, I think is great, is that all of the guys, I'm in touch with the whole band, and the Skunks had a lot of members over the years, and it's just all of the guys that I played with. I mean, there were people who played in the band after I left who I never met, but but yeah, I mean, after all this time, all the things that happened, um, we're still like family, and I think that's kind of awesome. Um,
Yes.
because that's not everybody's so fortunate. A lot of bands flame out, and the people wind up hating each other, and uh, for whatever gripes that maybe any one of us might have had over the years. We've put them aside, and now we focus on the good things that we had together, and I think that's a real positive thing. So the guys,
Absolutely.
yeah, putting together the Chaos and Skaville re-release, everybody who was involved in that project was really very, they jumped right. It wasn't like, I can't be bothered or anything like that. They're like, yeah, yeah.
Nice. And
So
speaking of that one, the Chaos in Skaville was re-released on vinyl on Jump Up. Just to throw that out there to everybody, go to Jump Up Records and buy it.
well,
And so that
actually,
was. Go ahead.
I've heard it's sold out. So
Oh, okay. Don't go to Discogs and see if you can find a copy. Like,
yeah,
it definitely might be. I got my copy, so I'm all right. Like,
good,
I'm good.
good.
So that was they had the group had one more album after you left. You apparently, I guess, left in '95 to start Eastern Standard Time.
Right. Yeah. So there was an album called No Apologies. I actually played on 3 songs on No
Okay.
Apologies, but it was released uh, after had started Eastern Standard Time. I had left the Skunks, and I just didn't think I would be able to do both bands, and so at that time, the Skunks had become more or less inactive. We had finished a big tour in the summer of '94, followed by a really, really grueling gigging schedule where we were living in DC but playing 3 nights of the week at the beach, which is about 5 hours away from us. And so there was a lot of this back and forth. Um, and I think it probably burned some of the guys out. They were just they needed a little bit of a break. But I was pretty aggressive at that point about wanting to keep pushing forward and just doing nothing but this. And ultimately, I was like, we got back from that tour and didn't speak to each other for months. And I was like, okay, I think it's time to start another band. But I didn't actually right away. Actually, what I did was I spent about a year between probably October of '94 and I don't know. Ted Morris can probably help me out a little bit better because it was sort of his urging that made Eastern Standard Time happen. It was probably sometime in the late fall of '95. Between that time, I just did session work. I played with basically any band that needed a drummer. I did a lot of Afro pop stuff, and a couple of ska things, a couple of punk things. I even played on a few metal things. You got to stay versatile,
Yeah.
and it's fun to play something different, right? Um, and then Ted, I have to give him credit for this. I had known Ted for some time because he was a DJ in Claremont, California, and had played the Skunks quite a bit on his show, or at least I hope he did. And But we had been friends for some time, and when he was in DC, a couple of times he had come out to shows, and then he moved to DC, and it was kind of a thing where like I had left the Skunks. Chris Watt was out of the Pie Tasters, Digital was out of the Checkered Cabs, and Ted said, "Look, we got these guys, and they're ace musicians. Let's do a traditional band." Because DC doesn't have traditional ska like the West Coast does. And we talked about it for a little while. And we're like, well, the thing about it is, um, you know, it's we should probably do something that's a little bit DC, and DC is really uh, known for jazz. Duke Ellington was from DC. We have a really, really rich history of jazz in Washington, DC. And so we decided what we would do is bring together, it would start off as a project, right? Bring together people from the ska scene, from the jazz scene, and give them a recipe, right? And see what ends up happening, right? Don't prescribe anything, because and one of the guiding principles is like, it's 1995, it's not 1963, we're not from Jamaica, we need to use the same recipe, um, and see what happens out of our own influences. And so for quite a while, it was an open door policy where our shows were more like jam sessions. We would have more or less a head, and we would have an ending, and whatever happened in between was made up. And those were some really interesting, fun shows, because because of the format, we'd have these heavy hitters in the jazz community come in one night, play with us, and they would just destroy the music, and it was really, really fun to see them interpret those types of things. And after a little while, it started to congeal around the same bunch of folks, and that's when Eastern Standard Time sort of started to take on a bit of coherence. But over the years, we've had a lot of people who've worked with the band, and I think that's might be a little bit distracting from the standpoint of someone who's like, oh, I'm going to go see Eastern Standard Time, and they show up and they're like, is this the same band? Um, and we were kind of accused of being, I think there's one guy who used to come to our shows all the time, who would accuse us of being shape-shifting lizards. Um, but that was part of the fun for us, is that it was always it was always an adventure. And over the years, we've now, we're now, it's a long time, it's quarter century. Right? So um so those early years were pretty fluid, and then it started to really gel around a pretty solid cohort of people, and that changed over time, but now we've been pretty stable. But it's funny how the guys who have been in the band for 7, 8, 9 years are like, oh, I'm the new guy. So
Nice. And so that is, you guys have done, looks like 5 full releases, then one live album. And as you said, yeah, there's I'm looking through the discogs where there's just a list of different members, but that is such a fun there's actually while you were talking about that, I was thinking of, there's a kind of jam band where it's everyone orchestra, and it's just
right.
whoever shows up, whoever wants to play a show and is available to play a show, that's who plays the show. And it's kind of like a free form, just jammy kind of thing. And that sounds kind of like that, like where it's, yeah, sometimes this person would play with us and sometimes they wouldn't, or they would come and go. And that sounds fun. That sounds fun.
When it works, it's absolutely mind-boggling how good it is, and when it doesn't work, it is a train wreck.
And so then you guys went on, and so like what you guys have backed, I guess, as Eastern Standard Time, back a number of greats. Are there any that you're like Derek Morgan, Roy Ellis, like, are there, like, were they just like, I guess, was there this like wow factor to that, or like you said, like back in the Skunks, it was kind of just like yeah, we're just doing what we're doing? Was it just like, yeah, I'm just drumming with a band, like it's another person I'm drumming with, or was there that
I mean,
awe of these guys?
I have to say,
Kind
it's
of
kind of it's this weird sort of mixture of the two, right? Where I give you a sort of an example about how, like, when you're the very first time that Eastern Standard Time backed Derek Morgan, I had I got the call saying, will you guys back him? I was like, yes. It's like, okay, well, you should talk to his manager. and sort out the details. So I call his manager. His manager says, "Well, here's Derek's number. Just call him and ask him what he wants you to learn to play." And so here, I pick up the phone and I call somebody whose music I've been listening to at this point for decades, right? And there's this whole thing of like, what is this conversation going to be like? And it took a second to sort of explain exactly who I was and what the context was and why I was calling. I said, we just want to make sure that we're prepared, that we know what you want us to play. And and I said, I can't remember exactly what I said. It was a funny thing because I said something along the lines of like, well, you what would what would you like us to play? And his answer was something along the lines of like, well, I know all of my songs, so what do you want me to play? And I was like, well, it's your show, so I don't feel really comfortable telling you what songs to play. But conveniently, I had actually found a live show of his, and I started asking, well, do you play this song and do you play that song? And one of the most fun things for me was that every time I would name a song, he would start singing it. And so it was really kind of a neat thing for me to have like my own personal concert, if you will. But one of the things that
That's awesome.
when you one of the things is like you have these people who've done these really amazing things musically, right? I mean, they're legends, but they're also people, right? And when you interact with people with respect and acknowledge uh, at the same time acknowledge like that, that they're amazing and that they've done amazing things. These folks have become my friends, right? I mean, it's not, they've done great things, and there's always going to be part of me that will be like, wow, it's amazing that that person who's done that amazing thing, I call them my friend now. But and by the same token, it's like when you get to know someone, they have lots of levels and lots of layers, and I think that actually helps you appreciate the music that they've made even more. So I've been incredibly fortunate to work with so many of these really just stellar musicians.
Nice. That is pretty awesome. I will say, just to toot your horn a little bit, that's kind of, we met on a Zoom happy hour and have chatted, and I was talking to the drummer from Eastern Standard Time in the Skunks. Like, what? Just to, like, it's really cool. Like, it's one of those, I get that. It's, to me, you are, you've been playing in these incredible bands for all these years. Like, it is awesome because I've been listening to these albums. Like, it is the music that has driven my life. And
Yeah.
so thank you for what you do
Oh, thank
as
you,
well.
thank you. I'm happy that you have found something in the music. I mean, it really does make me feel good when I hear those things because I mean, you do something, and I'm sure any musicians watching this or any artists of any sort will probably agree that when you do something, a lot of times afterwards you only see the faults, or the faults are the things that jump out at you the most. I mean, sometimes you'll listen to it and be like, that was kind of cool. We did some really cool stuff, but a lot of times for me, I hear the things that I would like to have done that are missing, right?
Yeah,
Or the tracks I would have liked to have played again, right? But we just didn't have time or whatever. So it's good to get out of that headspace, and I'm glad that you enjoyed uh, the music that we've made over the years.
absolutely. It's, I got the new album. Um, what's the I'm blanking the
Talking about time for
time
change.
for change. Yes, absolutely. Released on Jump Up in 2019. And that vinyl, I regularly have that one on play for sure.
Cool.
Good stuff.
Well, thank you for that.
Absolutely. So we have actually been chatting for quite a while. and
Yeah.
just going through your history. We had some other topics that we talked about. Do you want to delve into
It,
those if you have time? We don't have to.
I mean, that's up to you. I can
Awesome, awesome.
stay a little bit longer if you want
Let's
me
keep,
to.
yeah, like I mean, if you're good, I'm happy to keep this conversation going because I definitely loved hearing like the history and the skunks. And so all of this, and you talked about the more traditional sound with Eastern Standard Time, which is kind of the traditional sound, is what made me like we a conversation that we had that you delved into the history of the Scatolites and their music that they technically didn't all write the songs that they said that they did, and that was incredibly interesting to me
Well,
because
I
I did
mean,
not know that.
I right. So, I mean, this is also should be couched as not any criticism
Absolutely, oh, absolutely, absolutely.
by any rate. But I mean, I think part of that was just my own discovery that a lot of the Jamaican classics that I was listening to um, were covers. To put it another way, there were
Yes, yes,
ska versions of songs that were often um, all kinds of different um, songs, jazz songs, pop songs, various different Latin songs that I just hadn't been exposed to. But doing some research, you find out like, oh, I didn't realize that that wasn't an original song. Um, and this is one of the things that's really wonderful about looking at the history of music, because you when you learn what songs another musician plays that they didn't write themselves, gives you a lot of insight into what their inspiration was, right? So I mentioned earlier that I had been playing in after I left the Skunks, I was playing for a little while in like Afro pop bands. Part of that was a logical extension of me doing research to figure out what led to what led to what led to what, right? So where are these things coming from? What are these? Who's listening to what, and how is it influencing them? Stepping beyond the genres, and so that was about the time that I started finding out that like um, songs that were popular then have drifted out of our consciousness as oldies, right? What is played on oldies radio stations today in North America is like a really small subset and doesn't actually always reflect what people were listening to at the time, right? Because they tend to move all the easy listening and a lot of the Latin sounds. There's um, a lot of mambo stuff doesn't show up. A lot of the Brazilian influence stuff that was popular in the United States doesn't really show up as much. For that matter, I mean, it's really unusual on an oldie station when you'll hear something out of the Caribbean, which was, as people I'm sure watching know, charting in the United States. Um, and so in a way, it was sort of like a journey through my own musical ignorance, which I think is a thing that everybody should do, is just keep pushing, keep being curious about where the music that you listen to comes from, because you might learn a lot of things about that help you really appreciate the musicians that you look up to.
Absolutely. That is, I think, part of what this, the idea for this show is like I am Jamaican music, anything Jamaican music, anything that came from Jamaica. For some reason, that sound just it hits my head and it just makes everything happy. Like everything is
Yeah.
good, whether it's the roots reggae that came from Jamaica when it was the time of oppression. It's still just like it's all music of hope though, and it's like that. I think is one of the things that um, Jamaica has just brought that. I think it's, if people listen to it, you get that just feeling of happiness and hope
Mm,
out of the majority of that music. And you said, I think like that is true, like you say, oldies, and it seems to be the American oldies, not
mm,
necessarily anything else that was being played.
right. Or even, you'll go back and look at the charts and you'll see all these songs in there that like seem preposterous that anyone would like that enough for it to be a pop song. Like the singing nuns of such and such, or whatever. But I mean, it was a thing. The other thing about what you just said that I think is really fantastic, is, uh, and a lot of people have heard me sort of reflect on this before, but um, it is really a testament to the music of Jamaica at how many um, how many hearts it's touched around the entire globe. I can go to a club in Krakow, Poland, and there'll be people playing really amazing Jamaican music, right? It's all over the world. It has brought together a community of people who are interested in. Uh, I don't know. It's created a much wider community than um, than I think anybody might have thought at the time. Although Jimmy Cliff was singing about it, but at the same time, it's but he's right, right? I mean, it was everywhere, and um, everybody finds some connection in it, and I think that's really very special.
That
Yeah,
is, yeah. I think I was talking to a friend the other day about how just like when you think about it, yeah, like it all came, like all of this music essentially came from this small island in the Caribbean, and it was definitely their music that came from influences of other styles.
mm,
We kind of had this conversation, but like it was one of the things that I always found interesting is I feel like when people talk about traditional ska music, which came a lot from mento and the African music that came from Africa, because that was a lot of what Jamaica was, but also American R&B, American blues, and then jazz. And I think that was one of the things that when
yeah,
people go back and talk about, oh yeah, well, ska, it was mento mixed with American R&B and blues, and they completely leave out the jazz portion of that many of these musicians in that time were actually jazz musicians
and very
playing
accomplished
this
ones.
music. Yes.
Yeah, and incredibly good jazz musicians as well. Yeah, I think that is uh, sort of a hidden wrinkle for a lot of people, and part of it, I don't know. I wonder about this a lot because I think some of it is cultural, and uh, I think there's a certain uh, I don't know exactly why, but I believe that there's a certain amount of distancing that happened between a lot of the American youth culture that is interested in ska music and the American tradition of jazz music. That has come apart in a way. There are very few people that I find who are really into ska music and also really into jazz music. There are some, don't get me wrong. There's lots of people who do that, but there's some sort of a disconnect where a lot of people who uh, it seems like parents' music, or I don't know, maybe fusion jazz or smooth jazz has ruined it for people. The jazz is no longer subversive because, I mean, for much of its history, jazz was in many ways very punk rock. I mean, especially bebop. And yeah, I think a lot of people sort of in youth culture of the United States have lost track of that in ways that is not the case in other countries and cultures, which I find very interesting. So um, it's I hope that there's more interest in jazz that's starting to, people are starting to kind of open that up and be like, oh, I think I can maybe, maybe this is something I want to listen to. And to a certain extent, there was, with the swing revival that we had in the United States, people were getting more into jazz, but that was a specific scene, right? And you don't as much see people um, who are listening, to punk rock and jazz in their record collections like that.
Yeah,
That does ska and jazz is also not usually in a lot of people's record collections in the United States, which is kind of weird considering how close the two were in Jamaica,
absolutely.
right? How the musicians who were playing ska and were also playing jazz, and and some of them, that was uh, that was their bread and butter. They made that was the money, that was the money music, right? That
Yeah,
got you paid.
that's what they
Um,
would play out and about, and then they'd play the ska for fun.
or
At the time, I'm sure.
yeah. I mean, this is making broad generalizations, right? But
Yes, yes,
the point being that there's a tradition there that hasn't really made it quite through the various different hyphenations, until and I'll credit New York Ska Jazz Ensemble for really saying no, these two things belong together. Let us show you how this can be done. And they were groundbreaking in sort of putting that back into the consciousness of the ska scene, which I
absolutely.
think was well needed and has clearly had wide-reaching effects. I mean, there's now ska jazz bands all over the
Oh yeah,
globe,
absolutely.
and so I think that the connection is being reestablished. But I think that there's still work to be done to to get people to really kind of appreciate a music in its historical context. We tend to be very presentist about the way we look at things, even when we're um, you know in general interested in retro music, right? We tend to look at that through the eyes of today. And I think that the really, that there could be some real appreciation for jazz if people were to understand sort of how many boundaries it pushed in American society, in the early part of the first half of the 20th century, even into the early 70s even. Um, and I think that would be, if somebody has the mind to sit, if there's anybody watching this who pretty much only likes to listen to ska punk, I would say, give bebop a chance, because that was the punk rock of the 1940s. And a lot of that you don't realize until you're listening to what came before it, and then you're like, whoa, these guys were really doing something different. So
That is
yeah.
awesome. I'm making a note. So I am also planning. So I want to throw, as you're talking, I got all my thoughts running through my head, and like I feel like so I want to go back just a little bit, because I want to mention the one that you mentioned to me, which was Rock for Rock, which was the song that you mentioned to me that is actually a cover of the
Oh, right,
Scatolites, and
right,
kind of pulled that back in, and that was, um, from what I understand, I was actually talking to somebody else who you mentioned it was done by Desi Arnaz,
right. In the
but apparently
1940s.
it's even, if it's even a song older than that
Oh,
from
right.
what,
No, he
and
performed it. Yes,
yes,
yeah, yeah. No,
and
it
so
was
it's, and that is essentially, it was kind of a tempo change. Is that like a different arrangement from that to ska?
well, so it was um a rather up-tempo song. Um, El Cumbanchero is what it's called. Cumbanchero is a type of drummer. Um, and the song has El Combanchero has been performed by tons of people over the years. Um, and in a way, it's actually not surprising when you pull that back. You realize, okay, Rockford Rock is actually El Combanchero. Then you're like, okay, well, this makes sense because, of course, there would have to be if there's all these other versions of El Combanchero being played, there's got to be a Jamaican version, right? And so it does completely make sense. And I think one of the things that's really kind of fantastic about it is how that um, rhythm has been then taken and been used inside Jamaican culture for many other musical projects since then. And so, you've got, Sound Dimension lays this track. It's just a monster track, right? I mean, there's no doubting that that version is just um, killer. But yeah, so music has roots.
Yeah.
You got to keep looking down. Just
it's
keep
it's also interesting. Like it's
yeah.
I think one of the things I always talk about that like you don't really realize the people who are, I think like the people who are in the bands a lot of times, especially in ska bands when there's, anywhere from 6 to 15 people in a band. Sometimes those names they get lost, like unless it's like a well-known, like it's the lead singer or it's like the prominent band member. And that's like, I think that's one of the things that those connections between not only the scene within ska, but like those connections of like, well, what this person played in these three ska, like who Oscar Isaac, who is
Mm.
now in Star Wars and he used to be in a ska band, like that kind of stuff, like those connections of that, and like listening to, I think that was the history and all of that, like learning that it's such a, I'm gonna be that person who's gonna go, like I don't only listen to ska punk, but I'll definitely listen to some bebop. We're gonna find some of that. And
But
my goal with this is then I'm gonna do another show here on Monday for anybody
okay.
watching. Come join on Monday at 7 p.m. Central Time, and I'm gonna look up a lot of this stuff between now and Monday, and we'll have some
Oh,
videos to play, and we'll go back through and actually listen to some of these tunes and stuff like that. Kind of a throwback and continue the conversation in another episode. And
nice, nice.
but I am still digging this conversation. One of the other things that I was thinking about that you mentioned how jazz was kind of lost, and like that's, we talked about like the influence of Jamaican music and how like it is really, if you, I think people don't realize how much this island has since influenced the world in
Mm.
ska and in reggae and dub, bringing it to dance hall, which influenced hip
Mm.
hop. Dub influenced dubstep, which is, that's the popular music of kids these days. Who,
Is it still?
well, I mean, we'll say the young adults these days, not kids, but even the stuff like it is. I hear it's interesting to hear the stuff that is modern and go back and hear, like as I'm going through with my website, I go through videos and I'm like watching just music videos and stuff like that, and hearing these like dance hall videos of the
Mm.
70s
Yep.
that have drum and bass, and like it sounds different, but you can tell that the music that's being played on the radio nowadays, you're like, oh yeah, I definitely hear this in that. And it's, just like you said, where like Rockford Rock, well, you definitely hear that. Oh yeah, well that just makes sense. I get it. Like it has that
Right.
connection. And I think, like you said, like people lose that history. They lose that. They focus on what it is now, and they don't ever look at where it came from or where the history came from. And
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think part of that's natural, right? I mean, not everybody is really interested in digging into the history behind every single song they listen to. I mean, this is just a good song. I love it.
yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Absolutely.
And I also think that part of it is also that we live today in a hyper documented world. And w- a lot of this information is in people's heads. And the only way you're going to get it, because it hasn't been written down, is by talking to people. And I think that's one of the things that's really important is that generational transfer of knowledge. Um, and that's one of the things that I so enjoy about the experiences of working with people like Derek Morgan and Roy Ellis, um, is that what they may just say offhand, as like not even thinking it's a big deal, um, that's an important knowledge transfer. I'll give you an example, right? So I listened to tons of Derek Morgan's records. And very first rehearsal before we were about to back him, I sit down on the drums, we go into the song, and he stops the band. And I'm like, okay. And he turns to me and he's just like, what are you doing playing the drum that way? And I said, well, I mean, I was trying to play what's on the recording. And he's like, hit the snare drum, hit the snare drum, no cross sticking, hit the snare drum as hard as you can. It's like, this is dance music. People need to feel the beat. And I thought that was really fascinating because I'm trying to play it the way it sounds on the recording. And he was completely right, of course. Part of it is that in a lot of those recordings, what sounds like cross sticking is just the snare drum isn't recorded very well, or it's buried behind the band, or because of the way the recordings were made, you wanted to make sure that you restricted the amount of noise that the drums would make so that it wouldn't blast everything else out, right? Depending on what your microphone setup was, or your studio setup. But when it comes down to it, people need to hear that beat. And so yeah, I mean, he was right. And I wouldn't have known that. I would have gone on my merry way playing things as I thought I was hearing them on the recording. And so that generational knowledge is important, and now I've passed it on. So if any drummers are watching,
Hit
hit
that
that
snare
snare
drum.
drum.
Do it.
And I had a similar experience years ago. The Skunks opened up for the Special Beat, which was uh, for those who don't know, the members of the Specials and members of the English Beat got together and did a tour in the early '90s. And we did 2 nights together, and I got to become friends with John Bradbury, drummer for the Specials. And he watched me play the first night, and the second night we started really sort of talking shop. And he said, um, I can't remember exactly how it came up, but one of the things he said to me is like, when you're playing drums, I was like, I said something like, I love your snare drum sound. He's like, well, how you can get rid of it is by getting rid of those heavy metal drumsticks. He's like, play with the thinnest stick you can play without breaking it while you play. And that has changed the way my snare drum has sounded ever since. You want that high, snappy snare drum, you got to play with a thin stick, right? A thin diameter stick. And I had been playing with, rock and roll drumsticks. I never thought about going over to jazz drumsticks. And yeah, it's just little things like that. I mean, you don't really think about it. But when, one generation passes information on to the next generation, that oral history is really important. And there are people like Heather Augustine, for example, who are actively documenting this, and that is fantastic, to be gathering that knowledge and putting it into a form that preserves it. But it still has a lot of lore, right? A lot of stories, and the way you
Right.
get to the stories is by talking to people, right? And so anyway, I went on too much of a tangent there,
No,
but I
not at
just
all. Like
it,
you're talking about talking, and that's the whole point of all of this. So
yeah.
it's I'm enjoying it. Well, I think we can. I think we've had a wonderful conversation. I would love to get into much more, but I don't want to keep you all night. So we'll, you know, chat some more, and who knows, we'll maybe we'll chat again sometime. And because, like you said, the only way is to talk about it, and that's the one of the ideas behind all of this, is to get people here to talk about their knowledge and what they love and what they're passionate about,
Yeah.
and especially Jamaican music, because that's what I'm passionate about, and I love every bit of it. And I think that's, as I said, like, that's the history of this music. It's something that, I got into ska in the late '90s with the big boom of Real Big Fish and Save Ferris, and more and more as I'm like discovering reggae and dub, like I love this music, and it's all Jamaican music, and I didn't know all of this came from the same place. Like, it's very interesting stuff, and like then you learn, more about these artists that actually played ska music or played jazz before they played reggae, or and the influences and where it all came and how people created it. And
Hmm.
it's all fascinating, and we're gonna crack that egg open over and over, hopefully, on this Jamaican Sounds show.
Nice. Well, I wish you the best of luck with it.
Thank you
It's
very much, and thanks for taking some time out on a Friday night to just hang out and chat music, and it's always fun. I appreciate
my
it.
pleasure. My pleasure.
All
All
right, well,
right.
have a good one.
You
Thank you.
too. Take care.